I can't give her a lot of time because there wasn't enough alcohol in the blood. And I just sentenced somebody to something like, a year, but you do 6 months, and you do 3 months. And the judge said, what if I sentence her to having to go to a drug program and having to do some community service? How would you feel about that? My friend said, okay. And the judge called the other girl up and told her, and they both started to cry. And they hugged each other. And the mother came over, and she started to cry, and they hugged each other. What this story left me questioning was, do people, individuals who have experienced tremendous suffering and harm before healing, or did she need punishment? Did she need to feel that that person could be punished? So that's one question that experience left me with, was do human beings in some way, when something terrible happens to them, do they need to see punishment as a result? That's a question I have. My next story. When I was in prison and the Pell Grants that supported college were removed, we knew even at that time that Pell Grants gave people an opportunity in prison to walk through a different door than the one that they had come in from. College made a difference to people. It was so dramatic that it changed individuals' lives, it changed the atmosphere inside the prison, and it changed the recidivism rate. And that was known. But the Pell Grants were removed by Congress because it was felt that people in prison shouldn't have the benefit of a free education. And as we struggled to bring college back, met with people from the community, met with people from academic institutions, met with people from government, we had these discussions. Do people in prison deserve to go to college? And what became clear, and we finally got college reestablished with the help of a lot of people from the community, including my friend Michelle, who's sitting here and is going to speak, and it was done with private funding. There were enough people that felt that with private funding, at least it wasn't government funding. Today, still, colleges were closed throughout the country when the Pell Grants were removed, and in very few places does higher education exist inside of prisons. And yet we know that for people in prison, as well as for society, public safety, it makes a difference for somebody to get a chance to go to college in prison. And so I wonder, why does our society need to punish people? I was looking in my first question at the question of an individual need emotionally for someone to get punished for their harm. But when you look at the Pell Grants and the fact that still Congress will not give back money to support people going to prison, going to college when they're in prison, I ask myself the question, why is it that there's a need for society to punish people? I asked my classes where I teach, do you think that prison, simply being in prison, is enough punishment? And many people are not sure that simply being in prison is enough punishment. Why is it that as a society we need to punish? Last week in a youth group that I work with kids who have parents in prison, and it's a program to help kids go to college who have parents in prison. One kid said that he had just been in a cab, and the cab was pulled over, and he was frisked, stopped and frisked, forced to get out of the cab. The police officer couldn't even see them except through the window of the cab. He's 17, African-American, young man. Another guy said, he had just been arrested 2 weeks before, stopped and frisked, and it created a confrontation. And now he has a lot of money to pay, and he's doing community service, a Latino. Another young girl said 5 of her friends had just been arrested and taken to Rikers Island for 5 days. She's 16. So you look at that, there's 8 youth in this group. In 1 week, 3 out of the 8 talked about what happened to them by the police. And you think about the death penalty and how when a white person is killed, the percentage of, by an African American, how many get the death penalty. And yet, when a black person is killed by a white person, how few of the whites get the death penalty. And you think about, yes, punishment, whether it's by the police on the street or whether it's in the death penalty, it's intertwined with race, totally. What can we do about that? And I guess finally, my question, and it's come out of a meeting that some of us had, is there some role for punishment? Is there a role for punishment? Is there a need for punishment? Sophia had said, and I'm sure she's going to have a lot of other new things to say, so I'm happy to quote you, but Sophia said, you know, if we could separate out punishment from dehumanization, that in itself, maybe we could talk about something about punishment. So I'm raising all these questions for us to think about and talk about.
Would anyone like? Go ahead. Would anyone like to respond to any of those questions at this point, or how do we go on to a couple of keep going and then we'll keep going? Do you have a comment?
I do have one thing
Okay.
to say. When you talked about
Louder, please.
When you spoke about the woman who, well, what she did was when she finally saw that person face to face, then she could connect. But when it was an abstract, she wanted to punish.
She had seen the woman face to face about 12 times because she kept going south for every single hearing that existed. Saw her in the elevator, saw her, yes, she had.
But it was at that moment when it was going to actually happen.
It's hard for me. I think it was a lot of things that led up to her finally sort of knowing in a way that's what she made her feel better as well. But I don't know if she could have felt that way at first.
Yeah, just make a comment. You know, part of it sounds like, you know, as a society, we're not really taught to deal with grief and death. And part of it is this woman had to be extremely angry with, you know, coming from the background that she had. And this is probably, she didn't know how to properly grieve, and she was extremely angry, you know. And our society, you know, my brother-in-law always reminds me that we're from Puritan origins, and they're punitive. And, you know, we're sort of brought up that that's just how you deal with people that do things that are perceived as wrong to you.
So give them the culture. Yes, sir.
I was just going to say that what you're talking about sounds like what I think is often referred to as restorative justice. And I guess an obvious question would be, is whatever restorative justice is understood to mean, is that a good starting point? Is that a good framework to use within which to think about some of the questions that you're raising, or maybe not?
All right, one more.
Well, I'm also concerned about looking at the victim who didn't have a mother or didn't have somebody to care about them, and the distinctions between a victim's rights approach or even restorative justice and a more legalistic or, for lack of a better term, a legalistic way of looking at punishment when a victim's family or a victim doesn't have the right to either meet with a person in a restorative justice context or in a victim's rights statement context, the distinctions that exist, and what happens to those folks who don't have someone who's been hurt or harmed by an actual murder or manslaughter or things like that.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know, I thought that prison was, the justification wasn't just punishment, but that somebody is deemed a problem in society. And prison today, well, today if you consider it a real problem in society, they just kill you. There's no trial, there's nothing. They go out and they kill you, or that's what we're headed towards. So in a certain sense, as horrendous as these privatized prisons are, they're one step better than the alternative of what they're doing to people. It's not a question, I think, of punishment, although it's clothed in that as much as a societal control. And that's particularly obvious with the disproportionate that we see of who is deemed a threat to society. And I think from one point of view, they are correct. That there's a huge population of people who would challenge, and I think all of us here maybe could be in prison.
Wow, we've barely gone through one of our pedals, so we've got a whole room full of questions. So I think, why don't we continue with one more, and then we'll have a couple more, and we'll get back to these questions as well. Yeah.
What is the legal, Kathy said about the personal to the systemic racism? I work in a national faith-based organization working on restorative justice, but we've been trying to move restorative justice beyond the victim, perpetrator coming together in a criminal justice thing to say, what does it mean to restore justice about crime of slavery? What does it mean around immigrant rights that people did, they broke the law, so, and to say where is restorative justice, or in land-based issues for indigenous people? And it's obviously that much harder if people don't even want to go to the individual to say there's systemic issues behind this that need to be part of a restorative justice conversation.
No, okay. Actually, that might lead into one of Larry's questions that he wanted to answer. Larry White just came in. He's part of the Stop Mass Incarceration movement. And Larry, one of your questions has been, what changes in current criminal justice law would be required to diminish the primacy of punishment?
Yeah, first of all, let me define what I mean when I say the primacy of punishment. I mean, punishment has become so ingrained in our psyche now that I wouldn't challenge the whole, I said punishment has become so ingrained in our psyche, you know, that I wouldn't call into question, you know, the whole concept of punishment. I'm talking about the primacy of it. When I say the primacy of it, I mean, let's look at it in the criminal justice sense. When a person commits a crime, the first consideration is how serious the crime is. And the second consideration is how much punishment will be applied. You know? When we talk about reform or rehabilitation, that's way down the line. You know, that might not even be considered. But punishment is primary to our system of justice. And we have to ask ourselves, is it necessary, and what does it accomplish? And I'll show you a good question. You know, they say, well, it's all about public safety. You know? But if a person commits a crime, and you ask the public in general, or the community in general that's involved, what would you rather have, punishment for this guy, or would you have some reform where the criminal propensities of this person has been addressed, and he no longer commits crime? What would you rather have? And see, there's little doubt in my mind that most people would choose the punishment because they've been so, you know. First, let me say this here: punishment is a response to something. It really measures the relationship between people. It can be a relationship where you kick my dog, I stomp your cat. That kind of thing, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and all that. But if we had a society or a community in which the relationship between the people in that particular community was based on every person has the potential, all right, everybody has a chance to reach his full potential, because his full potential will add to the common, you know, goals of the community. If that relationship was that way, so that every person I saw, I'm really concerned about him reaching his potential, because his potential would be beneficial to the community as a whole. If that is the relationship, and when a person commits a wrong in that kind of relationship, the first thing that comes into question is how can this guy help? So, yeah, can we still achieve that potential in this person rather than just punishment itself? So the question comes in, we have to call into question our whole notions about punishment. And why must we have it? Punishment is, you know, we learn punishment. We don't come into this world with it. It's not embedded in us in any way, you know. We learn to do this. And we do it throughout our whole lives. I know it's with our very children, you know, our young children. We just say, don't do this. The smack must occur. Don't do that. Don't do that. And we need to question why we have this. Because punishment is the mechanism that we do everything that we find wrong with our criminal justice system. You know, it all revolves down to this whole idea of punishment. You know, one thing is certain, punishment doesn't really deter people. People shouldn't have any crime. I mean, you look how throughout history how punishment's been applied. We've cut off people's arms and legs and all that, and people still commit crime. So it's not a deterrent. Okay. If we look at it in terms of whether it reforms people or not, it's not a reformer. You know, it serves no other purpose than what they call just deserts, that is deserving. You know, I hate a philosopher in the criminal justice jurists tout the whole thing that it's deserved. Punishment is deserved. The person does wrong, and so he deserves to have some sort of punishment. You know, that construct, like I said before, is learned. You know, we have to look at what has punishment accomplished for us now. Not only in our criminal justice system, look in our foreign policy. I mean, when you look at what this country has become because of punishment, you know, it's always a get back. So I think what we have to do is call punishment into question, especially when it comes to how prime it is. I did 32 years in prison, yeah, and I remember I was in the box a couple of times, solitary confinement and all that. And when I came out, I was editor of a newspaper in one of the prisons, and so I wrote this, and it says that. For the person who must survive under it, punishment after an extended period of time is no longer punishment. It becomes something else, and so does that person.
I'm sorry, I came in on the entail. Your name, please?
Oh, Larry White.
Larry White?
Right.
Thank you.
Comments, questions?
I think another conversation that's probably relative to what he had to say is a discussion on the constructions of DBs, because before you can talk about punishment, we have to have a discussion on why certain things are criminal in the first place. I mean, there seems to be this thought pattern in America that the criminal justice system can fix everything. You know, there are certain acts that are probably more of a medical issue than a criminal justice issue. So I think that's certainly another issue that would probably have to be dealt with before we start the conversation about punishment, perhaps.
What we think the causes of crime are will largely determine what we do about it or how we react to it. So as you say, it's perceived as a medical issue or a psychological issue that conceivably respond to. You see, largely a moral issue or from our puritanical tradition than hardline punishment, law and order. Sophia, you are the executive director of the Correctional Association, and that organization has recently called for the closing of Attica Prison. Why have you taken that position?
Well, first we have to understand what the Correctional Association is. We're a not-for-profit organization that was founded in 1844, and 2 years later we were charged with a legislative mandate to go inside the prisons and monitor what is going on behind the walls, report our findings to the public, and then we advocate for change in the prison system, and we advocate for reform in the criminal injustice system. And so our work involves us going into these various facilities throughout New York State and interviewing prisoners, interviewing staff, administrators, collecting data, and then trying to give you, the public, the real story about what's happening. And so back in April of 2011, we visited Attica. And although there's a few minor improvements over the horrific conditions that existed 40 years ago when the Attica rebellion happened, by and large, Attica still is extremely problematic. It is very violent, and I'm talking about guard-on-prisoner violence. It ranks almost, I think it's second in the state for the prisons that we have monitored for blatant racism. It ranks, I think it's first or second in the state for sexual abuse and harassment. It is beyond repair. And so it's for those reasons that we've called for the closure of Attica. I brought our findings to the Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, and to Liz Glazier, who's the Deputy Secretary of Public Safety. We've shared our findings with them, and we're involved in discussions now about what can be done to change Attica. But it's our position at the Correctional Association that all the changes in the world can't fix it, because the culture, the horrific culture that existed 40 years ago has not changed. Attica, unlike a lot of the prisons, is totally staffed by an incestuous feeding from the community of generations and generations of guards. So not only do you have the guards coming generation after generation, but the civilians who work, say, in the grievance department are also related to the guards. So if you file a grievance against the guard, it's your cousin, your uncle, your aunt, your sister, your brother, your nephew who's going to get the grievance, and it's going to give it to the guard against who you're complaining. And then you are going to be subjected to more abuse and more mistreatment. And that has been an ongoing problem at Attica. So horrific that many of you were aware that in December of 2011, for the first time in the history of New York State, 4 guards from Attica were indicted and arrested and charged with physical abuse and conspiracy to cover up that abuse. And that physical abuse included handcuffing and shackling a man who was beaten so badly that multiple limbs were broken, and eye was dislodged from the socket, and he was thrown down the stairs, several flights of stairs, head first. Okay? Fortunately, finally, the Department of Corrections and Community Supervision has done something about it. They cooperated with the District Attorney's Office in collecting evidence about what took place, and these guards are going to be brought to trial. But there are many, many, many other instances throughout the system of horrific treatment. So we're hopeful that this prosecution will send a message to the rest throughout the entire system, to the corrections officers, that that kind of treatment is not going to be tolerated. Immediately after those guards were arrested, the Corrections Officers Union came forward and expressed their unconditional support for these officers. So that is why we're calling for the closure of Attica.
Yeah.
I brought some literature that I'm happy to pass around with people that includes, to people, that includes more details about why we're calling for the closure of Attica.
So, question, yeah.
Is it fair to say that the organization sends a tie based on the corruption above?
I'm sorry.
Is it fair to say that your organization sends a tie based on the corruption that exists above? So regardless how you are willing to help the inmate and support them with their complaint, you can do very little based on the corruptions. That's already, you have every good intention, but can you really support them? Or don't you have to target the hierarchy in order to get an answer?
Well, let me first explain, we're not a government entity at all. Okay? We're a not-for-profit organization, and our responsibility is to inform you, the public, the media, and our elected officials about the things that we find, and then it's the responsibility of all of us to call upon our elected officials to make change. So in that way, I don't feel our hands are tied, because nothing can stop us from sharing our findings with the public and then advocating for the public to push for change. That's the centerpiece of what we do.
So the voice is really the general public, which is what the public that we have today. The general public does not have that much leverage, as we all know.
You can vote.
I mean, I understand that as well, but it's like voting is good, but we all understand that. But for certain community, yes, I agree with you. Voting and touch base with your public official is pretty valid. But for the minority community, it is not, underprivileged, I should say, it is not as powerful as you know. You could make as much voice, you could vote as much as you want, but the power is greater than that.
I understand the point that you're making, but one thing I know for sure is if the public doesn't have the information, you can guarantee the public's not going to do anything. So the first thing is to make sure that we're getting the information and informing you, because this system is driven by ignorance. Okay? The goal is to keep the public from being informed. So we have to do everything possible, and the Correctional Association is charged with making sure that you, the public, we, the public, are informed about what's going on. And then, armed with that information, we can strategize about what to do next. But if we're devoid of the information, there's no strategy in place.
Yeah, so it's a watchdog organization.
Yes.
Have you made similar complaints before, and if so, have they been acted on? Or is this the first time that you made such a radical position in terms of closing one of the state's prisons?
Well, first I should share with you, Wednesday was my 1-year anniversary. So I'm real veteran now. Okay. But in the 168 years, to my knowledge, we haven't gone as far as calling for the closure of a facility. And Attica is the most notorious. Not that there aren't other problematic ones, because there are. But to my knowledge, it's the first time that our organization is going to the, what some might call extreme, of calling for the closure of a facility. Now, we've called for downsizing of the system as a whole, but to target a particular facility because of the horrible way in which it's run and the culture that is there, this is a first. We have brought recommendations to the Department of Corrections for decades. I mean, that's what we do. And we have been successful in bringing about some changes over the decades. That requires an inside and an outside game. Sometimes, as we all know, you get more at the negotiation table. Sometimes you get more at the demonstration table.
So again, just to piggyback on that, so the closure, you mentioned you're also interested in downsizing. What do you see as possible next steps in that, downsizing the prison population in New York State?
Right. Well, in the past 10 years, the prison population has gone down from 72,000 to 56,000, and the crime rate has gone down by 25%. So that obviously shows us you don't have to keep on locking up people for the crime rate to go down.
Right.
Okay. We found a couple of years ago that there were at least 8,000 empty beds in the New York State adult correctional system. We were literally paying guards for to guard empty spaces, all right? And, you know, many things have happened that are inexplicable, but an empty moving bunk has not happened. Okay? So we kept pressuring the governor and the Department of Corrections to close these empty facilities. All right? So about a year ago, the governor shut down 3,800 empty beds, which resulted in the ability to close 7 facilities. But there's another 4,200 at least to go. And I might say the decision as to which facilities he was going to close, we had a problem with, because medium and minimum security facilities were closed and work release programs, right? Which meant there's an overclassification of many prisoners as maximum security prisoners, which is driven by the guard union, because you need more guards to work in maximum security facilities, and they get paid more, longer hours, etc. All right, so there's an underlying economic problem that's driving this festering sore.
Yeah, maintaining the dependency of the system, right?
Yes.
And the following question also, you've been aware and also notifying us about the organized resistance to prison opposition in states like California, Georgia, and Ohio, and other states. What's your take on these protests, particularly resistance to ideas of solitary confinement? How is that connected also to the idea of the primacy of punishment, getting at that root?
Thank you for that question,
Yeah.
Jim. I think in order for people to appreciate the magnitude of the hunger strikes that have happened in several prisons, you have to understand that prisoners, it is deemed criminal behavior for prisoners to organize themselves, to have a petition, to engage in any organized activity. So the decision even to en masse stop eating is illegal as a prisoner, okay? And so the conditions that the people who are incarcerated are protesting are so horrific that they were willing to literally put their lives on the line to try to bring about some change. Because the abusive use of solitary confinement, and that's almost redundant, okay, is pervasive throughout the prison system in New York State. A lot of focus has been made on state facilities, but I want you to know the same draconian practice is used in the federal facilities throughout the country, and there's absolutely no monitoring of what's happening in these federal facilities. Nor is there any monitoring of what's happening in the immigration detention facilities. Yeah. The same problem. Okay? So the basic burying people alive by throwing them in solitary confinement for decades is what caused prisoners to engage in the extreme behavior of deciding to stop eating. Solitary confinement has been deemed to be a form of torture. Mm-hmm. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Abuses, Juan Mendez, has declared that anything more than 15 days of solitary confinement is not only torturous, but the human condition will start to deteriorate rapidly afterwards. In fact, you'll see changes after just 3 days. So one would ask, why in the world would we subject human beings to this? What is it that we hope to accomplish? Certainly, if the understanding is that the overwhelming majority of people who are incarcerated are eventually going to return to the community, why in the world would we want to make them more damaged when they come out than they were when they went in? That is the height of stupidity and evil, in whichever order you care to describe.
Breaking of their spirit. Yeah.
I just surmise that it's a lucrative business for some. And to treat prisoners in that fashion will ensure that business will not dry up.
Well, that is absolutely true. And that is why it's so important for us to do what we're doing now, get the information and put a stop to it. I would love to see that we're so effective that we don't need the Correctional Association. However, I suspect if we've been around for 168 years, we've got at least another 168 to go.
Can I ask you a question about privatization? Have you monitored differences between government facilities and privatized facilities?
Well, the Correctional Association is charged only with monitoring New York State, and New York State does not use private facilities for its adult system or its juvenile system. Fortunately.
How do you avoid it?
Excuse me?
How do you avoid having that happen?
The unions.
The unions?
That's the one good thing that the unions have been able to accomplish in this scenario. I applaud it.
Okay. Take it. In the back.
Yes, I'm a student in New Jersey, and I wanted to know if there's like a similar organization in New Jersey that you're aware of.
No, actually, thank you for asking that question. There are only 2 organizations in the United States that have legislative authority to go into the prisons and monitor what's happening. The other one is the Pennsylvania Prison Society, and the Pennsylvania Prison Society uses its access to advocate on individual cases. The Correctional Association is the only organization that uses that access to advocate for systemic change. There have been some people who contacted me from New Jersey who are interested in using the Correctional Association as a template to start something similar in New Jersey. But I have not heard from them since. I don't know if they actually got started.
You could conceivably help them.
We'd be happy to help them. That's actually one of the things that the Correctional Association is going to expand on doing, which is to become a resource throughout the country so that other organizations and individuals can look at what we've done. There's no need to remake the wheel. Right. We've developed an expertise. I mean, in 168 years, you can get a few things right. And
there you go.
We would welcome people coming to us to study what we do and replicate it in other parts of the country. We should not have to have Ohio, Georgia, California, and other places where people have to literally risk their lives to bring about changes such that they can just live with dignity and humanity.
So 3, 4, 5 years from now, you two are going to be crossing the river, you're going to be the executive director in Jersey? All right, good. We got that worked out. All right. Yes, sir. Yeah.
I just wondered, does New York participate in the prisoner lease program, or is it still going on around here?
Not in New York.
No.
No prisoner lease program in New York, thank goodness.
Can we give you a chance? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering if your organization has been looking at the attempt to expand solitary confinement at Rikers?
Our jurisdiction is only state facilities, but we are aware of the efforts at Rikers, and various staff people from the Correctional Association have been participating in various coalitions throughout the city in an effort to try to stop the expansion of the use of solitary confinement at Rikers Island. It's obviously a move backwards.
Yep.
I remember reading the article reporting the use of gang conspiracy laws by the prosecutor against the guards. That was pretty remarkable. You know, I can only speak to Rochester, but in Rochester, the police and the district attorneys really, really abuse conspiracy gang. I mean, they really, really set our youth up, and there are so many people in the state prison system from Rochester who were falsely, you know, inappropriately hung out with gang conspiracy charges. Is there any hope that that prosecutor would pursue that more? I mean, that's pretty remarkable that there was a first step.
I mean, if the prosecutor would use the gang...
Against the guards.
Right, against the guards. Well, let's just say this. An aberration is an aberration. So whether or not we're going to see another prosecution of guards for this kind of conduct, my crystal ball's not quite that clear yet. Hopefully this prosecution will send a significant enough signal so the guards will get their act together. By the way, they don't like being called guards. Which is why I try to remember to call them guards.
Yes, sir.
Correctional officer. I need to admit that 25 years ago, I worked for an organization called the Board of Corrections. And I put a year in there, and it may have been right out of school, I can't even remember. Maybe it was my second grown-up job. But I was a little bit upset with them, or the work that we were doing. I think at the time, the pretend work we were doing was enforcing consent decrees. Does that organization still exist? Do you have a relationship with them? And as a second question, do you guys do anything in terms of consent decree enforcement or help in terms of legal lawsuits by prisoners in order to actually remedy some of the things that you talked about?
Yeah, well, that was a lot of questions. I'm going to try to take them in reverse order. That was sneaky. I like it. So, the Correctional Association does not engage in litigation. So as a result, we would not be involved in necessarily monitoring implementation of a consent decree or conformance with the consent decree. Obviously, if there are policy measures that a court orders, or if there's policy or legislative changes, we advocate for the actual implementation and monitor the implementation of those changes. But I would not describe us as being directly involved in any kind of compliance with a consent decree. We have not been involved with the Board of Corrections, haven't heard from them. I don't think they're functioning. And, or if they are, they're not trying to let anybody know it. Yeah.
There's the state commission.
The state commission, yes. But something called the Board of Corrections, right, that's for the city. Right. And we're not involved with city monitoring. We do have a relationship with the state commission.
Yeah. They monitor.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you, sir.
They monitor Rikers.
They monitor Rikers. They monitor Rikers.
Right, the Board of Corrections, right, I know. We wouldn't be working with them because we only monitor state facilities. There are several different entities that are supposed to be monitoring city facilities. It would be really good if they got together in a room and had a discussion about their findings.
Yeah, I'm a little troubled here that we have this population that is incarcerated, and they're being viewed like they are bad. You're bad, you have to be punished, right? Okay, I don't agree with that. But I don't think people are basically bad. I think people are basically, you could say, I'd say good. I think at the heart, when the baby is born, whatever, generally unless they are exposed to some severe whatever, people are basically good. Now, I'm being introduced to this element they call the guards. They're bad. Okay, so we have one conception of bad, the prisoners, and the other conception of bad, the guards. I don't know. I mean, what made the guards bad, I don't quite understand that culture and where they come from. And it was my understanding, and I could be really wrong, that when IBM folded, there was huge unemployment upstate. And a lot of those people who had worked for IBM became prison guards. And what happened to them must have been a dramatic change, that they are now the guards who are enforcing in this brutal way policies that are really less than human. I mean, what is this? We don't live in a black and white world, you know, it's not you're bad, you're bad. No, something is fundamentally bothering me.
Well, let me talk about that. It's a very complex situation, right? So I want to try to demystify it. Many of the people who are employed as guards didn't start off, quote unquote, as bad people. There's an ongoing culture that exists in most of these facilities. So in much of the way I used to tell my students, I know that you're a good person, even though you think you're going to do good in the district attorney's office, you will not. Because there's a culture that exists that doesn't reward treating people in a humane fashion if you work in a prison. And so even if you come in with the best of intentions, quote unquote, the ruling class in the facility has a different mentality. And if you don't get in step with that culture, you won't survive in your job and you won't get promoted. In similar fashion, you see the same kind of phenomenon in the police department. Okay? And so you have power, and then you're in a position where you can abuse it against people who have no power. And there's no checks and balances inside the facility to stop that abuse of power. And no matter who is heading the Department of Corrections, they don't have the ability to take a laser view into what's happening behind those walls 24 hours a day. Even the superintendent doesn't have the ability to take a laser view as to what's happening behind the walls 24 hours a day. So for instance, at Attica, the superintendent is liked by the people who are incarcerated by and large. He walks the tier, he talks to the prisoners, but he's only there on one shift. And all the horrific things that happen during the 2 shifts when he's not there. So it's a complex problem. And I know I simplified it in my discussion, kind of like these people are good and these people are bad. It's not that simple. And I'm glad that you raised the question, because what we need is a major culture shift, right? In the facility and in the public at large, okay? Is that the public at large sends the message that we're not going to tolerate the mistreatment of human beings, no matter what they've been charged with, no matter what they've been convicted of. We're not going to tolerate it, right? Then that will stop.
I'm going to just add to that for a second, which is, I was in a prison that's close to New York City, and a lot of the correctional officers were African American and Latino. And I have to say that it was not as divided as it is upstate, where it's largely white and black or Latino prisoners, people in prison. It's not that the culture wasn't there in terms of power, but there were cracks in it that made a difference because of the identification that people had that were correctional officers. They were like, could have almost been me, or I saw you on the block I saw you on the block when you were growing up. It was like that. So it's interesting. It's again just adding to the complexity, I think, that Sophia is saying.
Oh, that makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
I mean, when I went to Attica in April 2011, the only officer of color that I saw the entire time I was there was the person at the front desk who went through our bags and made us, checked out our identification. But throughout the rest of the facility, and we saw dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of guards, not one. The prison population was the exact reverse. Yes.
I like to say that the organization's goal is to shut down Attica because it's irreparable in the things that they do. But my thing is, wouldn't that be like spreading the disease? Because you shut that facility down, those guards are not going to lose their jobs. They're going to be dispersed to other state facilities. And they're going to take with them what they used all along, the inhumane treatment of prisoners. So to me, that's really spreading the disease rather than getting rid of it.
No, I understand exactly what you're saying. The pivotal point, though, is that you have a concentrated, festering sore in Attica. By breaking it up, they don't have the same concentration of power. Okay? Now, I'm not saying there aren't problems in other facilities. Goodness knows that there are. Okay? But we get more complaints at the Correctional Association about Attica than we do about any other facility in the system. And there's a lot to choose from. Okay? So by spreading them out, hopefully they won't have the same ability because they won't be protected by their brothers, cousins, sisters, aunts, uncles, and nephews. Okay? I'm not saying that it's a complete solution, it's a partial solution.
Start.
Definitely a start.
Thank you. Steve, you want to talk also issues of mass incarceration?
Okay, I think I'm probably going to be the oddball out because I actually have a developed presentation, so you bear with me. I also like to address, but in this presentation, I was actually debating. I was going to edit it down, but at night I decided that I'm going to address some of the larger questions that I think are inherent in the room, and then we maybe have a discussion also with the panelists about it. So if you bear with me, I, by the way, am actually replacing Carl Dix from the Revolutionary Communist Party, who was supposed to be here, and for many reasons he couldn't be here. So I'm at least. Hopefully I can fill his shoes.
Stop and frisk. Please.
I'm with about mass incarceration, stop and frisk, and in the context of the politics of punishment. Okay. I would call this presentation more mass incarceration plus silence equals genocide, and I'm going to focus in on the question of genocide. Now, Carl Dix, I'm going to focus a little bit on Carl Dix because basically, as the person who leads my political work, I take a lot of inspiration from his analysis. Carl Dix basically has come at the question of mass incarceration again and again in his recent talk at the Riverside Church and also at UC Berkeley on the question of mass incarceration plus silence equals genocide. He has cited the question of many questions in terms of like what we're facing today in terms of the phenomenon of mass incarceration dovetailing with Michelle Alexander's analysis of the new Jim Crow. And particularly in New York City, identifying stop and frisk as a illegal racist police practice that is actually a major pipeline to mass incarceration, which Jim Ashley has been a participant in terms of some of the nonviolent civil disobedience. For people who are not familiar with Carl, he initiated the Stop Mass Incarceration Network in 2011, and it was he and Cornel West who initiated a call to take on the NYPD's racist and illegal stop and frisk policy. So let's get into it. And I will try to not read too fast, but at the same time I try not to read too slow. Racially targeted mass incarceration affecting Black and Latino and other poor communities has leaped by 800% over the past 4 decades. These horrific numbers of people in prison is the result of the very way this capitalist system works and consciously promotes discriminatory policies emanating from the high rungs of not only the government, but the ruling class of this society. Now, this system and this country came into being by exploiting the very ancestors of today's black youth as slaves It was able to exploit their great-grandparents as sharecroppers. It was able to exploit their grandparents as workers on the bottom tier of the workforce in the factories across the country. It was last hired, first fired. And these workers endured what we call double oppression in terms of racist oppression and capitalist exploitation. Now today, this system has developed in a way that is no way, in any way profitable to continue exploiting these young people, or particularly black people, as workers. We've seen development of globalization. We see outsourcing. This is where capitalism is heading. So this system that we live in today does not and cannot and will not have a future for this generation of black people, Latino people, and other poor people. Their only solution is actually, fundamentally speaking, poverty, prison, and punishment. Now, Carl Dix has characterized this as slow genocide. And I want to at least engage the audience in some discussion about what we mean by genocide. You know, when I came up during the 60s, I'm also that old. I'm actually a veteran of the Asian American Radical Movement in the San Francisco Bay Area, and also a graduate of the Federal Correctional Institution, Danbury, Connecticut, 1981. Genocide was a term that was almost loosely thrown around a lot in terms of reflecting on the oppression of black people and other oppressed people in society. But I think we look at what's going on today, I think an alarm has to be sounded in terms of, like, if we look at the international definition, genocide, we will see the very elements of it. Anyway, I'm detracting from my presentation. So we're looking at a slow genocide that can easily accelerate into a fast genocide. So let's take a look at maybe what a lot of people take for granted today in terms of what the terrain looks like. 2.4 million people incarcerated, most of them black and Latino, warehoused in prisons or in some form of protective or criminal justice custody. Black and Latino youth are basically criminalized, demonized, treated like criminals by the police and the criminal justice system. They're basically guilty until proven innocent, if they can survive their encounters with the police to prove their innocence. And I also say this as an organizer and activist with the October 22nd Coalition to Stop Police Brutality, Repression, and the Criminalization of a Generation, which Carl Dix is also a co-founder of. Now, Michelle Alexander also has, in her very important book, The New Jim Crow, has actually exposed to us, or to the general public, that former prisoners wear badges of shame and dishonor even after they serve their sentences, discriminated against, and virtually basically locked into a whole second-class citizenship caste system. Not allowed into public housing, denied access to government assistance, denied right to vote, et cetera, et cetera. And these numbers, in terms of 2.4 million people, do not even include the 363,000 immigrants who are locked into detention centers, which are even worse than prisons, waiting for deportation. Let me just do a quick quote from Carl in the interview he did with Davey D on KPFA on February 28th. He says, quote, "This has been a direction for over 4 decades, because if you go back to the Attica prison rebellion, at that time there were less than 300,000 people in prison back in 1971. Today it's more than 2.4 million, a more than 8-fold increase, which is rooted in the very operation of this capitalist setup and conscious policies that the rulers adopted to deal with how do we head off another 1960s type situation. I mean, they consciously laid that out. Richard Nixon is quoted, the president back then in late 60s and early 70s, he's quoted by members of his cabinet as having said at a cabinet meeting, the problem is the blacks, and we have to devise a solution that does not acknowledge that what we're dealing with. And they came up with solutions such as the war on drugs and the war on crime. And all these fundamentally are wars on the people. And I think we have to trace that back and also look at the content of these so-called wars on crime and wars on drugs, including things like Bill Clinton doubled the prison population in 1996. We looked at the Effective Death Penalty Act, which was passed in 1996, which also eliminated a lot of things we took for granted in terms of habeas corpus. This is the picture we are looking at in terms of the politics of punishment. These responses by the system have been policies consciously adopted to catch these youth in the web of the criminal justice system, to suppress them in ways that could keep them from rising the way that black people did during the 60s, which was very inspirational in terms of, from my perspective. And some of us call this a counterinsurgency in advance of the insurgency, in order to prevent that another insurgency to possibly come about. Now, again, I already cited Nixon and stuff, and people want to actually get to that particular quote. You can find that in the memoirs of H.R. Bob Haldeman, in his memoirs, the Haldeman Diaries, inside the Nixon White House, where the actual quote says, quote, Nixon emphasized that you have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to, end quote. Now, Michelle Alexander, again, which I mentioned earlier, through her book, The New Jim Crow, has been a groundbreaker and very important in terms of setting the terms for people understanding what's really out there. And I think the importance of this book cannot be underestimated. Other academics, too, I'm not just saying her, but other academics has also exposed the war on drugs, particularly, and particularly the crack and powder cocaine disparity. In other words, I'm assuming in this audience that people know the difference between the disparity in sentencing over rock crack, which is rock cocaine, versus powder cocaine. People can ask the question later on if people don't know what I'm referring to. Basically, what's prevalent in the ghetto and the barrios is where you find this crack, which is the rock form of cocaine, and people who in more than the white areas are actually using powder cocaine. And the disparity is that the incidence of drug usage in the black and white communities are basically the same in terms of proportion to in the respective communities. Yet at the same time, the sentencing and punishment is much, much, much greater in black and Latino communities. In New York City, the racist and illegal practice by the NYPD of stop and frisk serves as a major pipeline to mass incarceration. They stopped and frisked 684,000 plus people last year alone in New York City. 85% of them black or Latino, more than 90% of them they let go after they harassed you or humiliated you. But even then, of the 10% that they kept in custody or gave them tickets for, a lot of times it's for things like not having ID on them. So it's like waking up in Johannesburg, South Africa 30 years ago because it's a crime not having ID. So let me return again and sort of briefly encapsulate what all this means is that I submit to you the question of mass incarceration phenomenon we see today, plus silence in terms of like what's out there in terms of like the wanting of more mass outrage expressed in terms of what we saw during the 60s is not out there as, you know, we assume should be out there. And that's what I would call silence. So mass incarceration plus silence equals genocide. Why genocide? Because basically we're looking at a new system of social control that has genocidal elements in it and a definite genocidal direction to it. And I'm not just tossing around the term genocide, but let's look at some of the definition of what genocide is in terms of international definition. And this is based on 1948 United Nations Convention, which defines genocide as any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. 1, killing members of the group. 2, causing seriously bodily or mental harm to members of the group. 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. 4, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And 5, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And they define any of these elements can be defined as genocide. So let me go back and finish up what I was going to say. So we have seen in history what happens when whole groups of people, whether through explicitly directed racial laws or just what seems to be the workings of the system, when people are removed from society, stigmatized as enemies of decent people, and we can see elements of that, what happened in Nazi Germany, and then warehoused in prisons or prison-like conditions. Genocide doesn't have to happen overnight. it can develop in stages. Us, we cannot be tricked, misled, or intimidated into putting up with this. And the problem here is that too many of us are putting up with it, or going along to get along, or somehow not even recognizing the numbers that are involved in this, okay? So, on the contrary, what we need is we urgently need a massive, uncompromising movement that refuses to put up with this and calls into question the very legitimacy of such a system that would commit such a crime against humanity. We need to determine mass resistance, and in particular a national day of resistance to mass incarceration. So I'm calling attention, people may have received a flyer coming in, I have some here. We're calling on people to take the step, the important step, to mount uncompromising mass resistance against mass incarceration. And we're inviting people of all different political backgrounds, political perspectives. We need to be in the house together. So let me just say, what kind of mass resistance we're talking about? Well, we look at the flyer, it talks about, okay, let's see if we can find it. There must be rallies and demonstrations in cities across the country. College and high school students must hold teach-ins and other actions on their campuses. There need to be cultural events held on that day. The architects and enforcers of mass incarceration must be challenged over the inhumanity of the policies they're inflicting on society today. So let me close here with another quote from Carl Dix, and this is from his talk at the Riverside Church on February 18th. Quote, "No one should want to live in a society where people are denied rights because of the color of their skin. We need to wage fierce resistance to mass incarceration because that's crucial to wrenching society off the trajectory towards slow genocide. If we fail to do this, if we meet this horrific situation with silence, then people will be beaten down so far that we will never be able to do anything about all the hell they inflict on us. And we need to build this resistance because it will be impossible to ever have a revolution." Now remember, Carl Dix is a spokesperson for the Revolutionary Communist Party. And one of his catchphrases is, fight the power and transform people for revolution. And we need to build this resistance because it would be impossible to ever have a revolution and get rid of all the hell this system brings down on people here and around the world without a movement of resistance to a horrific injustice like mass incarceration. We can't respond to all this with silence. That would be deadly. Thank you.
Question. Yeah, we need help some air. Yeah, let the door open before we all.
I know some people have a hard time hearing if it opens. Just wave.
Yeah. The question is? Yeah.
We have the paradigm of justice, and whether by design or by chance happens to be predictive upon the population. There is a National Security Act that lock up Americans without any evidence and without any warrants. There's the legalization of torture. In Israel, we have a Berlin Wall type separation wall, have apartheid, have genocidal practices. So for this paradigm of justice, do we refer to address the system that is working currently? Do we work within the system, or are we prone just to have our own handcuffs and handcuff others and target others and incarcerate others before we ourselves get incarcerated?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by the paradigm of justice, because to me it's a paradigm of injustice that we have to deal with. And I think that, like, in this generation, a lot of this younger generation of peoples, there's a lot of people who want to do good, and they actually are beginning to look at towards advocacy organizations such as Correctional Association and other organizations.
Which one is that?
Correctional Association is one. I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying as one example. Because in terms of, I work for a nonprofit organization, but I think more the question that's necessary for people who are outraged by what's going on is that while it's important that these kind of advocacy organizations must be supported, what's more critical is that what needs to take place on the street. And I say that not in a rhetorical sense, but actually what takes place on the street, like we saw during the 60s, makes a huge difference, both in terms of if the question that we're facing is that it is indeed genocide or is moving towards genocide, and it's not a rhetorical flourish, that is actually being implemented on a national scale, regardless of the 50 states, then something needs to be done. An alarm needs to be sounded. And that in conjunction with advocacy organizations, we need to actually be out there in the streets taking direct action. And one of the reasons why the Stop and Frisk campaign was initiated by Cornel West and Carl Dix was that they recognized that there was a lot of academic research done about mass incarceration, stop and frisk. There was a lot of lawsuits being filed, and some on an individual basis, people winning some of these lawsuits about illegality and the racist nature of stop and frisk in New York City. However, what was missing that while there was a recognition, there's a debate taking place, among politicians, or even politicians placating some of us about that question, or even the fact that Ray Kelly, the NYPD commissioner, constantly gets invited to African American churches to speak. We actually, what is the cutting edge that's missing here? The cutting edge is direct action, and I'm talking about taking inspiration from the freedom riders, during the final days of Jim Crow, when the federal government had all these laws in place, but yet if you take a Greyhound bus and travel from New York City on I-95 down to the south past the Mason-Dixon line, boom, you saw that these laws had no effect. It wasn't until the freedom riders took the initiative, and I remind people that there was 6 in the beginning. We need to take that kind of action. We need to begin to say, challenge that. Because let me just bolster this understanding a little bit. I was in a meeting with, Carl and I had a meeting with a African American state senator. I'm not going to mention his name. And he was really concerned about the question of stop and frisk. In fact, he said it's racist, it's illegal, and I'm against it. But you know what the problem is? The problem is that the system, ideologically and politically, has sold a bill of goods to the community, broadly speaking. People in the community have bought into the question of stop and frisk, punishment too, again. Including the idea of punishment because of the question of crime. Yet at the same time, they hate it. So they can't reconcile the fact, and this is why not only education is necessary, we need to actually have direct action. Because we need to actually have this in the general atmosphere to begin the process of changing the terms of the discourse, changing the terms in which people are discussing it, changing in terms that, it's not enough just talking about, how can we tinker with the system. The question is something that's illegitimate that's permeating the air. That's my best response in terms of we need people on the streets taking action, and this is what's the missing ingredient. Now, I'm not saying it's totally missing. I think one thing is that what we saw in terms of the hunger strikes that took place in California was hugely inspirational. These are folks who have been thrown away, locked away, demonized at the worst of the worst, and they had the wherewithal and the vision to say, we're going to band together, even though we're atomized in individual cells, we're going to band together and take action, against injustice, because we're better than that. And that's very important to grasp. So the 2 hunger strikes, the stop and frisk, the stop and frisk civil disobedience movement that's initiated in New York City, these are very important beginnings. But we need to actually have something much more wider in terms of breadth and the depth on a national scale. That's what we really need.
For this translation. We are, yes, absolutely. Oh, she's going to tie everything together here.
Absolutely. I am closing Attica, in fact.
Michelle, thank you.
You're welcome, Sophia. It's really all right.
I haven't heard anything now. I'm Michelle.
Is that all right? Hi, I'm Michelle Fine. Thank you all. I bet it's like my relatives.
I'm your cousin.
Exactly, probably somewhere. So a few months ago, I was in Detroit because a parent organizing group took the position that teachers that didn't increase student test scores should be incarcerated.
Ooh. Really? Wow.
So that it was in Detroit, but it's actually it's a telling story because it reveals all the ways in which people have been sold on test scores as a measure of educational quality, and incarceration is the only way to hold people accountable. So in some ways, for me, it's just a very sad story, right? That we are so driven that within particularly poor communities, people are being sold on two commitments where somebody's making a lot of money, to raise your point, and lots of bodies are being sold down the river. So I actually want to look at the ways in which mass incarceration and criminalization is being sold to a whole set of public institutions, not just prisons. And it was because of the inspiration of Larry's thinking somewhere in the box many years ago that we're all here. So I thank you, Larry, for inviting us. You shouldn't have to go to the box to know that this kind of punishment is wrong. So I want to take you to 4 places where you might think these aren't related to prisons, or you might. Anybody here work in public schools? Okay, so do I need to tell you? So New York City has 5,000 police officers in their public schools, right? If it were its own police department, it would be the 5th largest in the country, right? These officers, anybody work in a school with, yeah, all right, so, right, okay. So these folks work for the NYPD. They do not work for the New York Board of Education. So a couple of stories. Eastside Community High School a few years ago, a very famous story. Young woman got to school a little early because she wanted to run upstairs and work with her teacher on a college application. The security guard downstairs said, you can't go up, it's night 8 o'clock. She said, I've got a college application, can't go up. Kid goes up the step, the guard grabs her. The principal, Mark Fetterman, hears about this. The principal goes down and says, what are you doing? I'm sorry, I should have told you she needs to come up for a college application. They said, too late, we're arresting her. Right? It says, Eastside Community is a beautiful school. It's a 6 through 12 on the Lower East Side. So he says, you know what? Don't perp walk her in front of the other kids. They're all lined up. You know, this is a 12th grader. Take her out the back. I'll follow you with my car and we'll... So they take her out the front. Mark throws his body against the door. They throw Mark on the ground, and they perp walk both Mark and the kid in front of the school. That is one of a whole set of stories. Lehman High School 2 years ago.
What do you mean by perp walk?
Where like a perpetrator, they humiliate. I mean, it's not humiliate. Where they walk you out in handcuffs. Public display. Not too different than what's happening to teachers on the cover of the New York Post for being the worst teacher. I'm not going to get there because we don't have time, but put it in your punishment brain. A few years ago at Lehman High School, Lehman doesn't have permanent cops. They've got rotating cops. So usually when the rotating cops show up, kids see it and they walk home because the large high schools, they are standing for blocks waiting to go through metal detectors in the morning. So at Lehman High School, they had rotating cops. A cop stops a kid and says, where's your pass? She says, I don't got to show you my pass. I have to say a lot of these stories about girls. I actually think that they're less scared that the girls are going to do something. And so the calls that we're getting are about girls who then say back, I don't got to show you my pass. You got to show me your pass. I don't got to. The cop goes to grab her. She has an umbrella, pokes the cop in the eye. She's taken out in handcuffs. We get her off with an anger management something, right? And the security officers remain, which is the point that you were raising earlier. I have to say these security officers are mostly untrained, poor women of color brought into the NYPD, right, without training, put in impossible circumstances where everybody's stressed. This is one of those complicated cases, right? And yet these sites are now deeply criminalized. Philadelphia 2 years ago, 25 kindergartners were suspended for zero tolerance, right? There's actually fantastic. We don't need any more research on this. I don't need to tell you, this is happening in Black and Latino schools. This is not happening in white schools. Right? So we're watching a kind of, remember how we used to fight military recruitment? We're fighting a kind of carceral recruitment. Alternatively, at Brandeis High School, people know Brandeis on the Upper West Side, newly gentrifying area. They decide to close Brandeis, reopen it as 4 schools. 3 non-selective schools, and then the Frank McCord School for the family of the new gentry. I'm at a meeting that's going to be a selective school, and the parents say, you know, our kids can't walk through those metal detectors. Maybe they should use the back entrance, right? And therein lies, when I've given this talk before, the apartheid of educational reform, and somebody from South Africa said, don't call it apartheid, call it Upper West Side, right? It's your issue, not ours. All right, so that's one place where these kind of commitments to punishment, incarceration, criminalization, I would add the testing regimes, are really new ways of producing science and justice of accountability that is absolutely foreclosing the lives of young people. And this is a slow, not so slow drip, right? And this is happening as Bloomberg is claiming credits for gentrifying and improving the schools. So that's one side. So let me go to another side. I work with a coalition called Arise. It's a coalition of immigrant women's groups dealing with domestic violence. And this is a story about the pathology of just having punishment as the only answer. So these are mostly undocumented women from Yemen and Southeast Asia and Orthodox Jews, and it's a very diverse group, none of whom speak prosecution, right? They're not going to get an order of protection. They're not going to call the cops. They don't want him to go to jail. They don't want to go to jail. They don't want to lose their kids. And the ways race and class and immigration are operating in those spaces, that's what will happen. VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, is deeply, they need the money, but it's deeply braided now with prosecutors' offices. These women are just stuck in their homes, in their communities, and the commitment to incarceration has furthered the danger that they're living with, right? That there are no alternatives, although we're trying to do some work to mobilize. What the city has done is, their answer is they have a domestic violence hotline that has 17 languages in it, like if you speak if you speak Farsi, press 5, right? So that's their answer to this problem. So there's like Attica, and then there's the ways in which punishment as our primary policy strategy is making lives for folks who are living in very difficult circumstances that much more difficult. 2 more examples, and then I'm going to open it up. Here's a quick one. Foster care systems now share databases with juvenile justice, right? So this stuff about gathering data, I have a foster son. When he was in the foster care, he's 35 now, but when he was in the system, it's a fucked up system, but it wasn't braided with juvenile justice. Now those are seamless systems, right? And so these kind of, the integration of these databases, and it's not integration, it's incarceration or criminalization becomes the dominant gene in this marriage. The third has to do with formerly incarcerated folks trying to go to college, right? Mm-hmm. Did their time, Pell Grants, Kathy and I, we've done that work. So now they're out, they're presumably free, they're just trying to go to college. So there's a new really important study that looked at higher education. It looks like higher ed has 3 reactions to formerly incarcerated folks. Although the SUNY system has a separate application system, by the way. If you check that you're formerly incarcerated, you apply through a separate vehicle. So the 3 strategies, one is universities ask and they don't take you. A second is they ask, they take you, and they say, welcome to our college. We're happy to take your tuition money. You can't stay after 2 o'clock. You can't be in any classes. Don't make any trouble. Don't you talk to any of the younger students, and you can't stay in the dorms. All right? So that's a pretty popular strategy. Again, these are the down low strategies that I'm trying to educate us about. And then the third is CUNY, right? So CUNY says, Mazel Tov, come. And then once you're accepted, they run the names through the Sex Offenders Registry Network, which is a large, growing, and dangerous network, increased by 25% in the last 5 years, I think, right? And then people are disinvited, much less financial aid, etc. So these are, and I guess my last example is, anybody at the CUNY protests in November, where we watch young people be smashed by police? You all saw the UC Davis tapes, right? the pepper spray tapes. And you might not know that young people occupied the new school for 10 days, but they never called the cops. It's very interesting. They negotiated with the young people, and there was a lot of damage, a lot of shit written on walls, by the end, it was a crowd of folks who were mostly more interested in destroying than negotiating. But they never called the cops. And they ran an article in Chronicle of Higher Ed, "We are not UC Davis." Well, CUNY chose a Davis-like strategy. And I need to tell you that they have now, a group of us met with the administration, and they said, well, you know, we're going to have a company come in. Who's making money off of all this? We need to be asking. We're having a company come in to check our security policies. Anybody want to guess who they hired? William Bratton. Right? That's deep. So, all right, so Bratton's making money, right? So I want to lay those out as the kind of racialized capillaries by which incarceration and criminalization is bleeding into communities. These are the slow leaks, not the ones where we're protesting enough. And so when we march, we need to be marching with youth organizers, young people in communities, educators who know how wrong this is and themselves are getting picked up by the police. We need to be asking who's making money, not just William Bratton. And we need to ask maybe why Coney 212 is so popular with young people. Anybody here have a 16-year-old? Right? It's like hot, and it's hot because it's like a video game. Like we took down Saddam and we took down Osama. There is just a way in which killing, incarceration, punishment, the Rutgers case in New Jersey, we're going to lock them up for 10 years and deport them at rate, that's becoming the kind of dominant conversation among young people within schools. And unless we interrupt it, it will not be interrupted. Enough. Thank you.
Let me give you a chance first. Yeah.
Just an observation to piggyback on the comments that you were making when you describe the security that's supposedly being provided within the schools. If you multiply that times the number that you gave, 5,000 times a yearly salary or whatever number, and then you apply that to the reduction in the resources that go to the school.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
It's mind-blowing.
It's a really deep realignment of resources, opportunities, and containment. This is not a reduction in budgets. Right. It is a realignment containing some and opening back doors to public schools for others.
I want to piggyback off of that because you've seen the same phenomena happening in the prisons. As the budget, the overall budget for the Department of Corrections was reduced, the decision as to how to spread out that reduction meant doing very little reduction in security, i.e. guards, all right, but drastically cutting the budget for health care services for incarcerated people, where already your health is compromised. So that it's, I don't know who's teaching who these bad practices, but they're feeding at the same trough.
And they're,
I think we're going to get back to the question is basically we're looking at poverty, prison, and punishment, and fundamentally this society, and I'm not talking about the people in the society, I'm talking about the people who run the society, they're only interested right now in the question of punishment because there's no future for people. I mean, we're in the midst of a financial crisis right now, and we've been, capitalism is having some difficulties, and while it has some reserves, is not interested in dividending things up, because that's not the logic of capital. Right now, what we're seeing is that the increase in both in terms of police brutality, which has been on the rise since the 90s in epidemic proportions, is punishment is what's on the scene. And I think the thing, even when you look at a question of education and the cutting of funds in education, it's because there's no future for inner city youth. Why should we train young people to be professionals or train them to go to college, because there's no future for them. Their future is to be warehoused. I think we need to grapple with that more, because I think a lot of us think that somehow we can sort of tinker of it, or we can put more pressure on that question. I think overall the message is very clear. It's punishment.
Right. In Wisconsin too, Governor Wright cut all the attempts to cut pensions and benefits, except increased budget for police and fire people. Yeah. Here.
Y'all scaring me in this room here.
Yeah.
This is a fucking heavy conversation here. We're talking about people being thrown downstairs and solitary confinement and people being tortured and all this. What the hell happened? This is supposed to be the democracy and freedom and all that. The question has to do with something you were raising about people come out of prison. They have no rights. And Plessy versus Ferguson was the one where he said that a black man has no rights that any white man is bound to respect. Now, there's millions of people who live in this country right now, who are in the housing projects, in the hood, who are literally afraid to walk down the street because of the fucking police. They're afraid, scared of the police. I'm not making, people know this. Go down there and talk to people. They don't want to walk out the door. And Raymond Kelly said, we want them to be afraid when they walk out. But at the same time, on the other hand, people are like, ever since the Giuliani years, everybody's happy because now you can walk through Central Park and it's beautiful and there's no crime out there and all of that. But you got that going on at the same time, and people are completely blinded and afraid. And then you have also that people come out of prison and they have no rights that anybody is bound to respect. They can do anything they want with millions of people out here. How is it? Where did all of this come from? When you talk about the fact people don't have any jobs. There's no jobs out here for any of the youth. And the police out here do whatever they want to people. Where are they supposed to go but into crime? What are they supposed to do? You have in Jamaica right now, Jamaica, Queens I'm talking about, 1 out of every 5 homes up there is in some state of foreclosure. And they said next year, how many people are going to be foreclosed on? They don't have a solution for any of that. But at the same time, everybody from Obama to Rick Santorum believes that something's being taken away from other people and given it to black folks. Obama actually agreed with that when he became president. He said, you don't have any excuses now. What kind of society is this we're living in, and what's it going to take to actually put an end to this? That's what people really got to be wondering about.
It was sickening the other day to watch the city council on Ray Kelly. It was sickening. People who I respected there, like Robert Jackson and Mrs. Franks, when he threw it back at them, when he counterattacked, well, what do you want? You want more crime? You want this? They didn't know what the hell to say. And so to the public that saw this on 2, 4, and 7, there it is. There it is. He's right. They got no answers for crime. They got no answers for anything. Ray Kelly's right. Stop and frisk. We got 400 million guns. We got bazookas. We can confiscate tanks, drones, and all this. And unfortunately, pieces like Robert Jackson just were stunned into silence because they don't have some of the analysis that we have here. Part of our mission would be to give them some of that analysis.
Absolutely.
Can I respond to?
Oh yeah, sure.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, because what we ought to say very easily, we talk about all this evidence-based analysis, etc. That's what the Constitution is supposed to be, okay? Kelly doesn't have to go anyplace else. There were people a good long while ago who came up with the Constitution to protect our rights, okay? So when he says, give me an alternative, what that says is he never understood what his charge was supposed to be from the beginning, and we ought to be calling to get rid of him.
That's right.
I thank you for those who mentioned the issue of detention as linked to prisons, and I just wanted to underscore the fact that when stop and frisk happened in the hundreds of thousands, as you were saying, and you're undocumented, even though you have committed no crime and you were let go immediately. I mean, they could have let you go. You're passed over to ICE, and so people are then entered into the detention system, even though they've just been picked up in a stop and frisk. So that's a really important thing. And then the other I just quickly wanted to mention is that in an earlier discussion we were mentioning that in the huge push by CCA and GEO to privatize prisons,
one of the things that is being presented now by CCA to state legislatures across the country is privatizing prisons and writing in a guaranteed occupation rate of 90% for the next 20 years. They want to write that into legislation. So everything that Michelle's been saying is the channeling. It would now be law that you have to produce people to fill those beds.
Yes.
People of color.
People of color. Just building on that, I feel that the realignment of resources towards mass incarceration, towards immigrant detention, towards the criminalization of a generation, I think basically amounts to the full-scale institutionalization of racist vigilantism. And it's not surprising to me that this is occurring at the same time that you're seeing, actual small-scale racial vigilantism start to emerge, start to enter that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, just two things. One is, any white person in this room should take a ride through the Far Rockaways when the kids get out of school. Just do it. I won't say any more about that. The other is...
You don't have to go that far, man. You can go down the block.
Huh?
You can go down...
Okay, well, I mean, I don't know around here, but I've been down there and I've seen there's nearly as many police as there is kids down there. And it's like, no wonder.
Absolutely.
And the other thing I wanted to mention was, I think it was in the 60s, you probably know about this, at Stanford. They did a study and they took the college students, they just split them in half were prisoners, half were guards. They had to stop the study because the guards started abusing the prisoners, and they were all just equal college kids.
And of equal color.
Yeah.
That in itself really made that experiment stand out.
Yeah.
All right, Steve is
There was a comment and a comment, I think.
Larry, can we get her?
What really scares me is that I'm new to Chicago.
Yes.
And the level of education is such that this conversation, these kids not only are not educated, but their parents were not educated, and their parents' parents were not educated. It's a whole culture of being deprived of a type of intelligence that can make them have a discussion like we're having now.